So it is a real pleasure for me again to introduce Dr. Trevor Stammers, an old friend going back over many years, and we've had him several times before on ICDA webinars. Dr. Stammers is editor of the New Bioethics Journal, and he was formerly Associate Professor of Bioethics and Medical Law at St. Mary's University Hospital, and was a family doctor for 27 years before going into academia. So he's really been at the coalface as well. He's currently writing a book on the ethics of organ donation, and his latest book with Callum McCullough, The Ethics of Generating Posthumans, is due out in February 2022. So do go to Amazon and pre-book that. So Trevor, it's a pleasure to hear you again on a slightly different angle on organ donation today, living organ donation. When is it ethical? Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for having me back once again. Now, the central question here may, in today's webinar, may appear to be rather odd, because organ donation is surely a good thing, self-evidently, and we ought to encourage it as much as we can, including from the living. And certainly any ethical discussion of the topic about organ transplantation generally and rightly is in favor of saving lives. So therefore, we should make donations both living and deceased as early as possible. Well, yes, so far so good. But does this mean always permitting donations from the living as long as they give appropriate consent? Well, I hope after this lecture, we can agree that there are some situations, at least, where donation from the living is, at the very least, morally debatable, and at least in some cases, morally indefensible. However, we'll start with the cause of all of the problems of organ and tissue transplantation, really, which is namely its own success. And this is a slide taken from the United States, showing very graphically in 2020 the excess of need for organs, people requiring transplantation, against those received, which is particularly acute in kidney supply. What is clear is that the picture there that's represented in the USA applies globally, and moreover, with the COVID pandemic, the situation as the pandemic recedes is much worse than before it started. Now, this is a slide from a recent study from the European Society for Organ Transplantation, which has recently been written up in The Lancet and looks at data from 22 countries scattered over the world. And overall in that study, solid organ transplantation fell by 16% globally. In the UK, it fell by approximately 1/3 during 2020 against the comparable period the previous year. And the largest fall in the study, which you see the data here, was in Argentina, where donation dropped by just under 61% overall. And that study estimated that just over 48,000 life years were lost due to COVID in relation to organ transplantation. So that's some very sobering data. And if we look at the data on the next slide, which those of you who heard my previous seminar may recognize, we see that at the far right end of the slide, in comparison to 2019 to 20, the figures for 2020 to 21 at the extreme right-hand side there show that the total number of donors and transplants dropped, but that also the waiting list dramatically dropped as well. And at least part of the reason for this must be that more people on the waiting list died. And this was largely due to the fact that, as you see from this rather busy slide, which divides donors into two categories of deceased donors, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the living donors are in gray. And you see there's a massive drop in the gray bars at the right-hand side of the slide from 2019 to 2020, when the figures fell from over 1,000 to 449. And that's because everything shut down. It wasn't safe for people to be living donors and so on. And so more people died on the waiting list who would have been saved by a living donation. And many died because they couldn't get dialysis either, because there was pressure on that, as well as ventilators. So this will only increase the pressures that were already existing, that I'm going to talk about in this talk. And if we look at the global figures, you can see there on the left-hand side that there were nearly 154,000 organs transplanted annually in 2019, and 100,000 of those were kidneys, and about 37,000 of those came from living donors. So the living donation of solid organs and also living donation of non-vital tissue and organs, particularly ovarian tissue and uterus, is increasingly common as well. So living donation is going to continue for many years yet. And in the early days of kidney transplantation, the general view at the time was summed up by one surgeon who viewed obtaining organs from living donors as the most sensitive and limiting issue in transplantation. And he hoped that the need for living donors would be completely eliminated by advances in tissue typing, immunosuppression, and organ preservation that I talked about several months ago in the seminar on organs from animals. And he also hoped that cadaveric organ recipients would become just as good as those from living donors. But on both these fronts, the expectation has not occurred. And so living donation continues to be an essential element of transplantation worldwide. And in fact, at the start of this millennium, another transplant surgeon commented, at present, living donor transplants represent the only immediate potential means for the amelioration of organ donor shortage. So living donation is here to stay, and what types of organs can come from living donation? Well, kidneys by far and away the leader in that particular field. And the risk of death from donating a kidney is round about 1 in 3,000. So a low risk in general. And the next commonest organ from living donors is a partial liver transplant. But the mortality rate of that is a bit higher, at somewhere around about 1 in 500. And then it's also possible to be a living donor of a part of a lung. And it may seem strange that one can be a living donor of a heart, but in the particular circumstance where if you are a person with chronic lung disease who requires a heart and lung transplant, but you have a healthy heart, then it is possible for your heart to be transplanted into another person. And if your heart and lung transplant goes well, you will remain living. And because these transplants are so important, there are various mechanisms to try and increase living donations. And you see the three main areas in which this is done there, and I'm going to go through them in turn. So the first is increasing the range of potential recipients. Now, I think up until recently, most people were unaware that you can, in the UK and many other countries, donate an organ to anyone. And a lot of people are still unaware of that, but the internet has changed this quite a bit. And the use of the internet as a means for people to advertise their need for an organ to gain potential donors is illegal in most countries, and it's been widely taken up in the United States. However, one objection to this is that it is unfair because the organs are likely to go to those who will have the most compelling and widespread publicity rather than those most in need. And another problematic issue ethically is that some people are willing to donate, but only with ethically troubling strings attached, as we say, conditions attached to it. And in the UK, some time back, organs were transplanted from a man whose family insisted that the organ should only be made available for transplantation if they went to white recipients. Now, that case was widely criticized, and the then health secretary commented, "I have not been an opponent of the apartheid movement for the whole of my adult life to see it introduced into the NHS." However, in the US, there was a case of a Jewish man who wanted to donate an organ to a particular child of his own faith, and this was defended on the grounds that the recipient concerned, the child, would be helped, and those below her on the waiting list would also move up, so no one would be harmed. However, such a justification logically would equally apply to the racist donation in England as well. So there are problems with this, but despite such concerns, the use of the internet to locate potential donors has increased, and a website called matchingdonors.com was launched in 2004 in the US, and the last time I looked, it boasted 15,688 registered potential donors. So I think this is going to continue, whatever reservations we might have about it. Another method is mechanisms to increase living donation, and introducing incentives fall into two main categories. The first is that of medical incentives, which can be positive, as in preferential access to organs if required by registered donors for deceased donation. So if you're on the register for deceased donation, you get preferential access if you need an organ yourself. Or correspondingly, they could be negative, such as prohibiting access to organs to anybody but those registered as deceased donors. Or you can have a points-based system in which those people who actually donate as living donors receive allocation priority in the future. And this, of course, might allay the fears of a potential donor whose reluctance to donate might be connected with concerns about their own health, should their sole remaining kidney later fail. And Israel is probably the best known of the countries incentivizing living donation in this way. And in 2008, Israel's Organ Transplant Act offered both a financial incentive by reimbursing expenses of being a living donor, and also awarded points to living donors to give them the highest priority if they required a transplant. And 5 years later, after passing that act, kidney donations had more than doubled. Living donations had more than doubled. But that impressive result was also due to the fact that up until 2008, Israel had also fully reimbursed all its citizens who obtained an organ in another country by means of transplant tourism. But when the Palermo Protocol in 2008 banned transplant tourism, this was stopped, and this promoted a further rise in donations in the country. So we have medical incentives, and then we have financial incentives, both of which were done by Israel, as I've spoken about. And then finally, there is relaxing the criteria for donation. As the need for organs continues to outstrip availability, then relaxing restrictions on things such as obesity, high blood pressure, and age, these have been gradually being relaxed to a certain extent for many years. And now consideration is also being given to, for example, patients with conditions such as multiple sclerosis, or even specific types of brain cancer that are thought not to be transmissible by organ transplantation. Now that's covered the kind of structure and what's happening with living donation. Let's focus a bit on the ethical principles involved. And these are the three main principles. With that little excursus to the door, I'm not going to go through them on this slide because I'm going to go through them one by one now. And the first one concerns consent. And I would suggest that living donation is unethical when consent is either not given or it is invalid. And I'm only going to talk, because of constraints on time, about competent patients, and I'm not going to talk about donation by children in this lecture. Now, competent patients need to give valid consent for any medical procedures done on them, and this slide shows the necessary criteria for consent to be valid in law in the UK, and probably countries across the world are very similar, that the person has to be competent, they have to be sufficiently informed, and they must not be subject to coercion or undue influence. And the concept of competence in British law is governed by the Mental Capacity Act of 2005 that says that competence is assumed, that's the default position, unless it can be demonstrated that a person is unable to make a decision for themselves. And the four criteria there are the test. Can they understand the information? Can they retain it? Can they evaluate it? And can they communicate, albeit by using sign language or writing or any other means? Can they communicate clearly their decision? The other ethical factor in regard to consent that really consent rests upon, of course, is autonomy or self-rule, the right of people to decide for themselves, which is the cornerstone, really, still of Western medical ethics. And up until maybe 5 years ago, perhaps a bit longer, it had taken on such a predominant role in bioethics, overruling everything else, that even some of its supporters had begun to talk about the tyranny of autonomy. But one element that's agreed upon regarding autonomous decision-making is that it should be free from coercion. But I think in organ donation, pressure of one sort or another to donate is probably the norm. And I think it's important not to confuse willingness with voluntariness. Now, voluntariness is often defined in terms of the absence of undue pressure from others. But I would suggest that a decision to donate might not be voluntary, even in the absence of what might generally be considered coercion. Though absence of coercion is essential for a voluntary decision, such an absence doesn't automatically make the decision voluntary. And in living donation, especially to another family member, can this ever be completely free from pressure? Emotional and moral commitments exist, but they need not necessarily, I think, be understood as constraints upon freedom. As moral agents, we are relational beings, and we can still be recognized as being able to make autonomous choices within those relationships. And I would suggest that it is possible to be both afraid and aware of the huge expectations of a family to donate, and yet to be able to make that choice freely. And the reluctance that understandably accompanies the act does not necessarily diminish the autonomy of the person making it. Now, secondly, donation is unethical when the harms exceed the benefits. This ethicist, who's quite a frequent writer on this topic, says the trouble with determining whether benefit is appropriate given the risk is that what counts as a high risk in relation to benefit involves a subjective evaluation, and then makes the second point that morality is not about taking polls or votes, and there are no objective measures of risk-benefit evaluations. Now, I would suggest that nevertheless, subjective measures of risk and benefit are things that we do every day, whether we're simply crossing the road or deciding whether or not to have that second slice of cake. And although I totally agree that morality by popular vote is not a strong ethical foundation at all, particularly when the people voting may not fully understand what they're voting for, nevertheless, if a measure is going to have any positive effect in the world, then the ethic behind it needs to be able to gain sufficient moral traction in a sizable enough section of the population for them to own it and implement it. Nicola Williams is an ethicist who has talked a lot about harms and benefits with regard to organ donation. And she makes the arguments of the necessity of regarding harm thresholds for donors from three main points of view. The first is along the lines of the dead donor rule. Now, this is a rule that states that you should not take organs for transplantation from people unless they are dead. And so by extrapolation, if you are going to inflict harm that may lead to their death or severely impair them, that's not good. So you need a threshold there. And then she also talks about what we would think of a person who took advantage of another's death. And what kind of person would we be if we willingly took a heart from someone who had decided they wanted to donate that, or both of their kidneys, and so on. When we take that, do we not do moral harm to ourselves? And the third point that she raises are utilitarian concerns, that if you allow risky forms of organ donation, this could result in widespread negative consequences. And I think she's from the US, and in that context, she says that increases in rates of donor morbidity and mortality could, for example, lead to the closing down of transplant programs by administrators concerned to improve hospitals' reputations concerning such statistics. And it may lead to a reduction in the number of willing donors in future who may be discouraged by inflated statistics regarding donor risk. So if you're involved in transplantation, it's absolutely essential to maintain public trust. And once that goes, then you may find that there are unintended side effects that bring everything to a halt, as happened famously in Japan in a heart transplant case there that stopped all transplantation there for decades. Now, just for the sake of completeness, I'm going to mention one other category that I'm not going to have time to go into in great detail here, but it is something that relates to the area of uncertainty between the living and the dead. And just in preparing this talk, the question of the angels to those at the tomb as to why seek ye the living among the dead took on a rather sinister twist in a world where I believe that living donation is unethical when it deliberately causes death or worse to the donor. I'm just going to flag up 4 areas where I have concerns that this is either taking place or there is pressure for it to take place. And then I'll take questions. So non-therapeutic ventilation, as I think it should be called, elective ventilation. This was a term that first appeared in the Lancet in 1990 when some doctors in the UK from Exeter Hospital used this term to refer to the practice of ventilating patients with severe stroke who were considered to be certain to die and who normally would be left to die, but they were ventilated solely for the reason of keeping their organs oxygenated. And there's quite a tale as to what happened to that, but it was very, very successful in improving the transplant rate, and that hospital did exceedingly well during the period they did this in terms of the number of transplantations they carried out. Then there is the suggestion that organs should be taken from those who are as good as dead, in the opinion of those ethicists. And these are particularly patients with persistent disorders of consciousness. So folks, for example, in what was called a persistent vegetative state, who were not thought to recover, why not, from a utilitarian point of view, give these patients a chance to have some opportunity to give life to others with relatives' permission. Then there have been some cases of organ removal from anencephalic infants. And often this is justified on the grounds that these children are either not human, or if they are human, they are not alive. And of course, both of those statements are completely false. They are human and they are alive. They're in the ethical dilemma. And then finally, with euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, which is less relevant here, but that's also beginning to shift into this bracket, that certainly in those countries that allow euthanasia, they also permit, and indeed in the case of Canada, encourage organ donation to follow after it in suitable subjects. And of course, what more suitable subject could you desire than a young autistic woman in her 20s whose life is unbearably full of suffering. She's physically healthy and has organs that could save many lives and be delivered to the operating table at the time of the surgeon's choice, because the death could be timed to suit the particular recipient. So living donation in most circumstances is something indeed that we should be encouraging, but not at the price of undermining trust when the whole transplantation enterprise could then be jeopardized. And I will come into land at that point and hand back to Peter.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for a most illuminating talk. And we've got a time of question and answer now. So let's move to the questions, and please do bring those questions in. Can I just ask, first of all, and I know you've covered this to some degree, but in showing the statistics, but do you think there is really a need for living donation in the sense that would we be able to increase other sorts of donation if we really tried and used the right techniques such that living donation would not be required and that Williams would be much happier? So can you see a way around this, or really are we, if we're going to meet the need, we have to accept living donation?
I think that in the state of the art as we have it now and in the foreseeable future, the need for living donation will always be there. Obviously, if in the Brave New World that we talked about last time, it does become cheap and easy to have an organ quickly produced from an animal that's going to be a perfect match, then that could supplant both deceased and living donations. But I because of the problems I spoke about last time, I cannot see that happening at any point soon. So I think for the foreseeable future, living donation will be required. And that's purely because where you've got a match and a willing donor, the chances of success for the recipient are that much higher. Yeah. You're not so likely to have an organ failure as with other types. Though,
do the success rates between living and dead donation, are they appreciable? I mean, for example, if we think about kidney donation, have you got a much better chance to receive of having it work if you receive a living donation of a kidney rather than one from a cadaver?
I'm not going to wing it, because there are almost certainly transplant surgeons and those involved in transplantation medicine who are listening, and the degree of or the sort of percentage betterness of living donation, I am not sure about. I don't think the margins are huge, but I think wherever there is one treatment that's better than another, clearly there are going to be people who want to go down that route if they possibly can. Somebody may in the chat room, if they know the stats, want to put those in.
Yeah. Thanks. So you mentioned this case in Japan, which I'm sure everybody is intrigued about, Trevor. Do you know? Can you give us any more detail about the heart transplant case in Japan that led to heart transplant stopping in that country, and what the line was that they crossed?
Well, it was a perfect storm of disaster, and the name of the case is something like Watanabe or Watanabe, and I will get the right name to Josh and circulate a link about it. But what happened was that the surgeon had too much of a vested interest, and I think was caring for both the donor and the recipient. And normally there should be a distinction between the two. And not only had he done that, there were very big concerns that the death of the donor had been hastened in order to obtain the organ. And I think that there were no heart transplants carried out for 30 years after that. It was certainly decades.
No,
it's a while since I wrote that chapter.
Yeah, but this is no heart transplants at all in Japan for...
That is correct. Yes, there were none for decades. Yeah.
Now we're all aware of extreme cases of organ procurement. One thinks of prisoners on death row being sacrificed for organs, or organs being harvested against their will from street children, for example. You hear of these stories, but one that's perhaps much more relevant, especially to the developing world, is people selling their organs in order to raise money, and not to fuel an indulgent lifestyle, but just for mere survival. What about poverty promoting living organ donation, particularly living kidney donation? Is there a place for that? Is it ethical? What are the boundaries? What should the law say?
I'm really glad you've raised that, because I had contemplated talking about this in the talk, but I think there's a very interesting relationship between organ sales and living donation. And T. Wilkinson, who's written a book on the ethics of organ donation, says in his chapter on living donation that for him, the most interesting ethical issue is that all of the ethical reasons for living donation that makes that commendable also apply carte blanche to organ trade and selling your organs as well. And I would part company with that for a whole variety of reasons. But the main one is that I don't know of an ethicist who is in favor of organ sales who also, they also seem to universally believe that somebody in extreme poverty who's up to their eyeballs in debt and are approached by an organ trafficker about selling their organ, these ethicists believe that it is possible for such a person to give valid consent. And they make the argument that, if they hadn't weighed up in the light of the circumstances that they were in, that, this was a better bargain, they wouldn't do it. And to me, this is the delusion of the affluent and those who just haven't a clue about what it means to live in dire poverty. And they seem to believe that, you know, these people will live happily ever after, where all the on-the-ground evidence shows that they are out of work, they're often die earlier and so on. So I think that you know, that those are important factors to bear in mind, and that it is unethical to be transplanted with an organ that has been taken from a living donor for the reasons that I've given. Yeah, I'll go for the question about trust, because that's something that I didn't major on, about how can trust be built up in living donor transplantation. And I think that's a long-term project, because just as the loss of trust in Japan took 30 years to rebuild, if for various reasons there is a lack of trust in doctors because of malpractice and you know, people treating patients for their own gain rather than care for the patients and so on, you've got to work across the board at establishing trust in doctors first of all, and then in setting up a caring situation where people, by word of mouth, know that they are going to be looked after and cared for. It's a very delicate structure that and takes time. But the Christian foundations of sacrificial care for others, truthfulness, integrity, and so on, are all absolutely key in making such reparations. And Peter looks as if he is back. I've just answered the question about trust building, Peter.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, this has certainly been a webinar to remember. With, well, at the risk, I hopefully not repeating anything, but I wanted just to come back to this question on organ donation following euthanasia as well. Many of our listeners would have been shocked to hear about that. It does happen in places like the Netherlands and Canada. How widespread is it, and how big a risk is it with the legalization of euthanasia?
Well, the cases are relatively few, because for many cases requiring euthanasia, organs wouldn't be suitable. So I think I'm particularly concerned about those countries where euthanasia has been around for long enough for it to be extended to either the psychologically suffering, or indeed people who are perfectly healthy but just tired of life. And of course, you don't need to be beyond the age where your organs are of use to be tired of life. And this is the reality of the situation in Belgium, particularly. And in Canada, as I understand it, in many states in Canada now, the option to donate your organs is part of the protocol of signing up for what they euphemistically call medical assistance in dying. So the transplantation system has become locked into this source of supply. And I hope at the very least in such countries, if they do value informed consent, if not the lives of those who want to die, that the recipients are informed of the source of these organs, because certainly I would not want to be transplanted with an organ from a young person who had been euthanized that I might live. And I'm sure many Canadians and Belgians would feel the same.
You also mentioned, Trevor, the case of PDOC, prolonged disorders of consciousness. And we know when this first started off, you had to be brain dead, and there were some people who had reservations with that. But now with the recognition of persistent vegetative state and minimally conscious state as well, are we on the, or perhaps even severe stroke or dementia? Are we on a dangerous slippery slope here with with people with diminished brain function for whatever reason being used?
I think we've got to be eternally vigilant. And the practice of elective ventilation that I mentioned in the 90s at Heavitree Hospital in Exeter is an interesting example of that, because it went on for quite some time because it was so successful. But one of the pragmatic reasons against it is because no prognosis is absolutely certain, and of course, as well as hopefully you hoped that the folks that you put onto ventilation, would stop breathing and be dead. But there is the possibility that you might, in fact, precipitate them into a permanent state or a persistent state of unconsciousness. There was no guarantee that they would progress to brain death and not stop breathing when you turn the ventilator off. And that was one of the practical problems of it. And the second one was that the practice led to a huge sickness and absence rate, particularly of operating theatre staff and nursing staff, who felt that these patients were being murdered. The paper that I have sent to Josh for when you send that out will give chapter and verse for all these problems. So I think if that happened with elective ventilation, I think if people, there are several ethicists who write repeated papers about, we must scrap the dead donor rule and we must, start taking organs to save lives from those who are not quite dead. I think we'll see a kickback in terms of its effect on medical staff. And if patients are truly informed about what is going on, then the patients and relatives of the potential donors may also be alarmed. Often it's couched in euphemistic terms. An ethicist from Harvard called Renee Fox wrote an article about a particular protocol of deceased donation, in inverted commas, in the States, and entitled the article "An Ignoble Form of Cannibalism." Now, that's pretty striking.
Yeah. There's a question here about organ trafficking in Latin America, Central and South, in the face of this reality as well. Any comment on how widespread this actually is and what can be done to prevent it? I mean, I'm assuming that most of the people involved in this will have medical qualifications.
Yes, and one of the things that, again, I've written about and I'm working on an article at the moment is that although trafficking in people for organs and trafficking in organs forms only about 5% of human trafficking overall. It's mainly for forced labor or sexual exploitation. It's the only form that could be eradicated overnight if the medical profession did not collude with it. Yeah. So this is a serious criminal activity that wrecks people's lives and sometimes kills them, that doctors have to be at the forefront of, otherwise it couldn't take place. And I don't know so much about Latin America. There was a very famous case in South Africa where multiple medical staff, I think they were into double figures, and certainly 3 or 4 surgeons and kidney physicians were all prosecuted and jailed for their involvement. But where you have independent hospitals, such as has been mushrooming more recently in Nepal, I know there's been a real increase in this kind of activity there as things have tightened down in India, and many more private hospitals are opening up in Nepal. So it is a heinous crime, and we need doctors of integrity to not be involved in it, but also, I think, speak up. I mean, after a dinner party not so long ago, a consultant physician told me about another consultant physician who wondered where his patient's kidney had appeared from, but, you know, didn't take it any further and wanted to keep stum. Well, sometimes we need to speak out, particularly for those who can't speak out for themselves.
Yes, indeed. One of the main arguments against the legalization of euthanasia and against voluntary euthanasia is the question about whether any ever acts of that kind are truly free and voluntary. We often hear saying that people feel pressure, whether real or imagined, to request early death so as not to be a burden upon others. And you've hinted at this early on in your talk as well. Coercion for organ transplantation is one thing, but what about where a family member just feels a sense of duty to do it, and how can that be safeguarded against, particularly under pressure from stronger characters, or feeling this sense of duty to donate?
Are we talking about a euthanasia situation here? Or
I was just using euthanasia as a similar example, where people sometimes feel a duty to request euthanasia, but in the same way, people could feel a duty to donate an organ, especially to a loved one or relative, where the choice is not truly free and voluntary, and there hasn't been any act of coercion, but nonetheless the person feels this internalized sense of ought to do it.
Yes, I think that's where the transplant team and all those associated with carrying out the surgery, this is why the importance of speaking face to face with potential donors on their own, and making sure about the motivation and willingness and voluntariness of the decision is very important. It's impossible to completely guarantee, but certainly the more probing you do, the more likely you are to ensure that somebody is not being forced into it. But one of the things I think is again another problem that's been highlighted today. The pressure in the NHS is such that seeing patients face to face and spending time with them is now at a greater premium than it was before. But it's never more important, I think, than in transplantation medicine.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're just finally, because we've more or less run out of time now, but what specific role do you think Christian doctors and other health professionals have in this whole arena?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I haven't had any particular sort of biblical verses to share is because it seems to me from beginning to end, the fruits of the Spirit, and particularly, even patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, these are all things that should be present in the lives of believers. By common grace, they may be present in the lives of others too, but if they are absent, then they will be filled with the opposite. And so for each of us to make sure each day that we are putting that into practice will help to curb some of the worst excesses of the abuse of the system. But it does take huge strength if there is a collusion of a team that you suspect. Exposing evil can sometimes mean that they turn on you, and you have to be prepared to pay the price for that.
You talked before about the importance of being prepared to whistleblow and ask questions and to speak up for the vulnerable who may be exploited. So it just remains for me to say thanks again to our speaker, Dr. Trevor Stammers. We hope we'll have you back again, Trevor, in the future. We look forward to that new book coming out. We'll tell people about that too on our letter. Thank you to our translators. And finally, thank you to all of you for coming along and listening today. God bless you, and we hope we'll see you again.